It's a new year, meaning it's time for me to make my annual wildlife photo book for my close friends and family. In this book, I take my best photos from the past year of animals and put all the best ones in here. At the end of August last year, I made a video on how I make this book in ArcGIS Pro with data-driven pages. This year, I have a decision to make on the maps that are included in the book. In the previous 2 years, I have been using the Stamen Watercolor map as the base map for each map, and then in the inset map on each page, I use the ESRI watercolor service as it also gives place names, and that helps it give it more context. However, as mentioned in my August video, the Stamen watercolor map is no longer available for free. I want to continue using a watercolor style for my maps. So do I pay the few dollars to get access to the Stamen watercolor map tiles API? Do I just switch to using the ESRI watercolor map service as the whole map image? Or do I make my own? I find the Stamen watercolor to be superior. I think it does a convincing job of looking like a real watercolor artwork, whereas the ESRI has an unconvincing procedural look. Where the Stamen has variability in edge accuracy, giving it a handmade look, the ESRI version has edges that you can tell come directly from the same geometry as the underlying data. Where the Stamen has high quality image textures of watercolors, the ESRI version has obvious computer rendering. I was prepared to subscribe to the Stamen map service. However, the age of the dataset is beginning to show. I didn't talk about it in my August video, but one of my sites for my 2022 book does not show up in that dataset at all. So I had to recreate the watercolor style for myself for that single map. Luckily, the cartographers at Stamen published a blog post detailing how they achieved the look of their watercolor map style. There's a link for that in the description below. In short, they render out all of their tiles with multiple colors representing each data type, such as roads, water, land, forest, etc. Then they isolate each color in the render as a mask, blur it, overlay some noise, and then apply a threshold. The blur, noise, and threshold give the natural, uneven border look to the watercolor texture. After that, they then apply a sort of shadow to the data to give a natural look to the way paint would build up on the edges of the border stroke. While my recreation for the 2022 book was obviously not the same as the real Stamen watercolor, with that experience, I felt that I could recreate the effect for all of the maps in my 2023 book from scratch. To get started, I went to my local art supplies store and bought a cheap watercolor set that also includes a paintbrush. I then got out a large stack of printer paper and just started experimenting with different stroke styles, different levels of paint, different colors, and repainting the same area multiple. Most of my texture paintings were whole A4 pages, and some were about the area of an A5 page. A settled effect of the Stamen watercolor is the texture of the paper. Easily overlooked, but it does a lot for the texture. Printer paper is smooth and untextured, and when painted, the only noticeable feature is the watercolor itself. Next, I scanned all of my watercolors at the highest quality and resolution that I could. The edges of my watercolors were ragged, so I clipped all of the working files down to the maximum area of all the watercolor in the scan. It was at this point I realized that all of my textures should have been made on the whole A4 size pages, not the half pages. Now with all my scans prepared, I cheated a bit on generating new ones. One of the features of Photoshop is that you can shift the hue of an image, changing a blue to any other color such as orange or red. To do this, you can open any color image, press Ctrl U, and then slide the hue slider. However, there is a better method, and that is to use a hue saturation adjustment layer. This is the non-destructive method to be able to change the colors and also to edit those changes that you've made later. In this process, I realized that it is easier to change the looks of a slightly darker pigment than it is to change the colors of a slightly lighter pigment. So in the future, I would just make textures with royal blues, browns, oranges, forest greens, purples, and reds, not pinks, yellows, or bright greens. I saved all the different colors and then moved on to the GIS portion of the project. I downloaded data from GeoFabric, a website that hosts large extracts from the OpenStreetMap dataset. As someone who understands hosting and bandwidth costs, I feel bad as I downloaded both the protocol buffer format and the shapefiles of the Netherlands, Italy, Sweden, and Denmark, the countries featured in my maps this year. The protocol buffer format gives you all the data and attributes and only comes in points, lines, polylines, and polygons, whereas the shapefile format comes in pre-sorted files with themes such as buildings, water polygons, water lines, land use, and much more. A good base dataset that I think many GIS professionals should actually just have on hand are the OpenStreetMap extracts of water and land. These don't come from GeoFabric, they actually come from OpenStreetMap on their wiki. Armed with these datasets, I explored them and whittled them down to the features that I wanted to show, and removed the ones that I didn't want, ending up with all lines and polygons. I chose land, water, buildings, heather, industrial, forest, roads, railways, and I grouped grasslands and meadows together, and farms, orchards, and vineyards together. Next, I specified my map page coverages, which this year I thought would be better to use a polygon area of interest rather than the points dataset that I created last year with defined scales. That was not ideal. With my map pages defined, I created two layouts with the data-driven pages. One being final layouts at the final size of an 8.5-inch square, with zero space added around my areas of interest. The second layout is basically the same data-driven pages setup, but made for masking the different layers. This was a 9.5-inch square and 20% extra space around the defined area of interest. With my chosen datasets and layouts, I used data-driven pages to export mask images, where all of the features are in white and the background of the page is in black. This resulted in several hundred images, one per combination of dataset and map page. Another feature of exporting from ArcGIS Pro is that you can export georeferencing with a map image, so my final product can be replaced exactly where it needs to go when I'm finished. Also, if you're not familiar by what I mean by mask, it's just a grayscale image that affects the color channel data. A black mask pixel would mean the color channels would be fully transparent, and a white pixel would show full opacity. Shades of gray would be percentage of gray that they are transparent. To recreate the Stamen effect in my 2022 book, I experimented with filters in Photoshop. Gaussian blur and Perlin noise are readily available, but the thresholding part is not. So I decided that I would choose a blending mode to achieve the thresholding functionality, and decided vivid light or hard mix are the best to merge. Thus, apply the Gaussian blur to the mask layer, generate the Perlin noise, and then change the blending mode of the Perlin noise to a hard mix, and then save all that out to a new mask. I consider myself an intermediate Python programmer. I initially tried to implement this image processing procedure with Pillow. The Gaussian blur would have been easy, and I could just randomly crop Perlin noise image generated elsewhere. However, applying the threshold and recreating the hard mix blending mode would be more difficult. So I processed all the images with Photoshop automation. Now with all of my masks, I need to actually apply them to something. And it was back to the watercolors from earlier. My watercolors are not a specific size, and they did not match the actual input of the mask images. So I decided on all of the different colors that I would use for each of the different types of data, and then I blended it together images that match the dimensions of the mask layers. I find the workflow in Photoshop to apply masks using alpha layers mildly infuriating. So I implemented in Python and Pillow the watercolor textures and masking, randomly rotating the watercolors 0, 90, 180, or 270 degrees, and then applying the mask layer to that image to get the alpha effect. If you want to reuse the code that I made to generate this effect, there's a link to a GitHub page in the description below. Back in ArcGIS Pro, I imported all of my masked watercolors, and the georeference files worked exactly as they should. I grouped all the masks by site and applied min-max with custom statistics to all the images. I did that with ArcPy, code in the same repository below. I then rearranged the draw order manually on all of the images and turned some layers on and off based on their looks. Finally, all of my maps are ready to go. I continued on with point formatting and exporting like my video last year. I'm quite happy with the way that my maps turned out. I think I'm going to get the Den Bosch map printed on a poster to put on my wall. Looking at my maps and comparing them to the Stam Watercolor versions though, I did learn a few things. The shadow process that I skipped over is very important, giving a more realistic look. Maybe I'll try to perfect that process for next year's book. The colors in my map are vibrant and would not naturally blend on a real canvas. I should be more discerning about my color selection next year. I think something that I didn't understand at first about the Stamen method and the way that they have it look more natural is the way that they actually render their masks. Stamen in their blog post renders out a single image with each dataset a different color and then extracts individual colors to texture that space. I rendered out each dataset individually and then joined them later. I think the purpose of the Stamen method is to avoid the map looking too busy with too much data and allowing for little bits of white space. However, my approach gives me more flexibility later and deciding up what will actually end up in the final product. A couple days after finishing the maps and the layout of the book, I had an imagery training with ESRI Nederland at work. In the training, we were discussing mosaic datasets, and I realized I could have made my life so much easier by bringing all of the masked watercolors into a mosaic datasets, adding 2 attributes: the map name and the data type. Then I could have bulk adjusted the drawing order, image display, and then when I exported, I could just use the data-driven pages to limit the mosaic dataset to show only where the page name matches on both. Thanks for watching. If you haven't seen my August video about making photo books with data-driven pages in ArcGIS Pro, go check it out. Link in description. If you like trains or GIS, please subscribe. And if you have any comments or feedback, please write in the comments. Thanks for watching. Bye.